and welcome to another episode of Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Juma Iraqi, and today I have with me Eric Trexler talking about caffeine. Eric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast with me on caffeine. You've done a lot of research lately on this topic. So before we get into the questions, could you give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Eric Trexler. I am a PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill, working on a lot of exercise and nutrition research. Outside of that, I come from a powerlifting, bodybuilding background. Currently do a little bit of powerlifting coaching. Spend the rest of my time in the lab.
Sounds great. Are you still competing now, or are you taking some time off?
Yeah, doing a lot of training at the moment, not a lot of competing, but definitely with the intention to compete again in both within the next 2 to 3 years.
Sounds great. And when do you finish your PhD?
That is a good question. Right now I'm anticipating probably the spring of 2019. So that plus or minus a year should probably be where I finish up. Okay,
sounds great. Okay, so today's topic is caffeine, and just to get the questions going, could you please explain what caffeine actually does in the body?
Absolutely. So caffeine is a pretty amazing thing, and the more I get into studying physiology, the more I start to realize that the brain really is calling the shots in just about everything. So the main mechanism by which caffeine is working is by influencing adenosine receptors, and especially those that are in the brain. So it basically is an antagonist. It goes into these adenosine receptors and blocks them from taking in adenosine. And so the effects of that are very widespread throughout the body. So most people who've had coffee or caffeine supplement intuitively know the effects of caffeine. So basically, they range across the whole body. It's from things as simple as just general arousal and that alertness you get from it. But there's also effects on the endocrine system, substrate utilization, and then certainly effects on athletic performance. So caffeine research and exercise started out looking at endurance performance. And we know at this point very consistently and conclusively that caffeine does enhance endurance performance. And lately that has kind of shifted more towards strength and power performance, which is more of the research that I've done with it. But there's still, it's not quite as conclusive as with endurance exercise, but there's certainly evidence to suggest that caffeine, when taken at proper timing and dosage, definitely can help with performance with strength and sprint outcomes.
Excellent. So besides the performance part, is there any research that caffeine can have some beneficial effects on general health?
Absolutely, yeah. That's what's funny is I feel like if you go back 20 or 30 years ago, there was this thought that caffeine was inherently bad for you. So in some of the courses I teach here at UNC, we ask students to do basically a week-long project where they track their intake. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people tell me, well, my diet's terrible, but the good news is I'm not using caffeine anymore. And it's like one of those things that it's very pervasive and it won't go away, this idea that caffeine's inherently bad for you. But the more research that comes out recently, we see that caffeine has really unexpected positive health effects. So I just wrote a paper for a course talking about caffeine's effects on Parkinson's disease. And it turns out that there's a very clear and very well understood effect by which caffeine can be effective there. And it appears to certainly help from a preventative side. Whether or not it can mitigate some of the effects once you have Parkinson's disease, that's still a little unclear. But we've seen numerous studies, things involving eye health and function, brain health and function, that appear to indicate that, assuming you're not using a really ridiculous daily dose of caffeine, there do seem to be some pretty widespread health benefits as well.
Interesting.
And I should point out, though, that usually these are epidemiology studies, so it's hard to say if it's necessarily caffeine or if it's caffeinated beverages. So will a supplement of caffeine, will that do the exact same as coffee or tea? That stuff we still need a little more clarity on, just as a caveat.
Okay, excellent. So, like you mentioned, there's a lot of research both on endurance and resistance exercise that show that caffeine improves performance. When we talk about performance, is there any difference if you ingest it in, like, for example, liquid form, like coffee, or if you ingest it in a supplement form?
So that was actually the purpose of one of my studies that I've done with caffeine. It's funny, there was a paper in 1998 that had a very good design that said, we found that if you drink coffee before this endurance protocol, you see no performance benefit, but a caffeine supplement did cause a benefit. But what they also found was if they took decaffeinated coffee and put in a caffeine supplement, it still didn't improve performance.
Okay.
So it was this very kind of unusual finding, not what you would expect, but they said you should have your caffeine coming from supplements rather than coffee if you want to improve performance. And I didn't see any attempts to replicate that within, honestly, it had been 10 to 15 years before I started planning my study. There was one that I did come across that was very recent, but basically there was this idea that caffeine supplements were better than a caffeinated beverage like coffee. And in the work that's come out really within the last 5 years, it's starting to look less likely that that's true. So my findings, along with a couple other recent findings, seem to indicate that if you have the same dose of caffeine coming from coffee or a supplement, they seem to have the same effect on performance.
Okay, interesting. So in terms of, like, for example, what would be practical for athletes, for example? Because like, for instance, I work with a lot of athletes, and sometimes when we're trying to get the amounts of caffeine really high, people usually goes towards the supplements instead of drinking the high amounts of energy drinks and coffee. And what I've personally observed with the athletes is actually that it seems that they get less digestive issues when they actually take the supplements compared to drinking the high amounts of coffee. Is that something you experienced in the study that you did? Was that something you looked at?
With our study, specifically looking at the caffeine part of it, we did not see that to be the case. Mm-hmm. However, it's really important to note that for our study, we had a placebo, a caffeine powder, and a coffee powder. So what's important there is that the volume of fluid that they ingested was the same across groups.
Okay.
So it sounds like, if you want an athlete to get a really high caffeine dosage from coffee, they're probably going to have to drink a much higher volume of fluid. So that might be playing into that effect, mm-hmm. if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I certainly don't have any issues with, reverting or focusing your attention on supplementation here. The one thing that I would be a little bit more cautious about is using powdered caffeine supplements for the general user, just because they can be very, very difficult to measure. So not a supplement containing caffeine, but if you're using pure caffeine powder, if you try to bring out a 300 milligram dose and you don't have a really excellent scale, that's where you start to run into cases where people accidentally take a lot more than they intended to, which can be fairly unpleasant. So I would say if you're going to do a caffeine supplement, it's totally fine, but use one that's kind of pre-packaged into an appropriate dose, or go with a pill so that you're not trying to, visually figure out if you have 300 milligrams or 600, because the doses are so small at that point, it can be really hard to tell.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So what's the another issue that people sometimes experience when they do take caffeine is sleep disturbance. So what's the half-life of caffeine?
Yeah, the half-life, you'll see different estimates at different places, but generally they say about 6 hours, give or take, should be the half-life. It is important to note, though, that I think genetics is a really exciting thing in sport and nutrition research that we're just starting to uncover the tip of that iceberg. But this is one case for certain where with caffeine, it looks like there's different genetic factors that say basically they influence the rate at which a person might metabolize caffeine.
Yeah.
So I would say, even if the half-life is, we'll say 6 hours, if you say, well, if I have it afternoon, I still can't sleep at 9, that could be a real thing. So I think there's a lot of individual differences there. And on the other end of the spectrum, I actually fell asleep sitting up a couple weeks ago with, I basically drank a whole cup of coffee and fell asleep with it in my hands, like right that second. So people's tolerance to caffeine and people's ability to metabolize it at different rates, it can vary quite a bit.
It's funny you mention it because if I work out late in the afternoon, I'll usually use a lower dose of caffeine, like energy drink with probably about 80, maybe 160 milligrams of caffeine. And that doesn't seem to disturb my sleep. But even if I take, like I've experienced that, if I take 200 to 250 milligrams of caffeine in a supplement form, after 2 o'clock, I really struggle to sleep at night. So I have to take it before noon if I don't want to have. But I don't seem to have the same issues when I take it in a liquid form. So I gears towards that if it's later in the afternoon, and basically if I'm going to take the supplements, I usually take them pretty early. So I think I'm one of the guys that metabolize it really, really slowly.
Yeah, and it's a good point that you bring up, and kind of a weakness in the little anecdote that I told. But throughout the history of caffeine research, there have been a lot of times where we inappropriately equate coffee to basically be caffeine water. And it's really not. With coffee, you have well over 100 biologically and physiologically active compounds within the solution. So that's kind of one of the reasons why in the research I've done on caffeine, we include a coffee group as well, because they are not biologically equivalent to just say caffeine is coffee, coffee's caffeine. And there are probably some compounds in coffee that can influence some of the effects we get from a pure caffeine dose. So chlorogenic acids are typically a big class of compounds that come up in that discussion. So one might argue if that I was drinking a pure caffeine solution rather than coffee, maybe I wouldn't have fallen asleep. So it's kind of splitting hairs, but it is an important point to bring up when you're evaluating caffeine and coffee research.
Interesting point. So what seems to be the optimal dosage of caffeine to ingest right before a workout?
So with caffeine dosing, it looks like for most people 3 to 5 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. Okay, so easy way to kind of scale that out. If you have, if you weigh between 60 to 100 kilograms, you'd be shooting for about 300 milligrams of caffeine. Okay, and in general, you'd like to take that somewhere between 30 to 90 minutes before your exercise begins. So a lot of research does 60. Some do as low as 30, some do as high as 90, but that's usually the pretty safe dosing protocol. And I say safe in terms of making sure you're maximizing your benefit. An acute overdose value it's estimated at about 10,000 milligrams, which is a remarkably high dose. You'll never accidentally do that unless you have no idea what powder you're using. And yeah, so that's the typical protocol that most will recommend.
Okay. But what if you're a coffee drinker, drinks a couple of cups of coffee every day? Will you see the same benefits if you supplement with caffeine?
Right. So you're referring to the concept of habituation. So the idea that if you habitually use caffeine, will you adapt to it and kind of lose its benefits or its effects? And the caffeine habituation, in my opinion, we have surprisingly small amounts of information about it, especially pertaining to exercise. Right now, the safest conclusion you can draw, or the most appropriate, would be that performance does not suffer compared to people who don't use caffeine. So habituation appears to be specific to the exact effect that you're looking at. So if I drink coffee 3 cups every day, I probably won't get as high of a heart rate or a blood pressure response as somebody who doesn't use coffee if I'm given a caffeine supplement. But it appears that whether you drink coffee every day or you never drink it, in the studies where we give someone caffeine or coffee and have them exercise, it seems to work basically the same. So, personally, at some point in my career, I'm kind of just getting started on the research side. I'd really like to do more direct research figuring out the time course of habituation and also the time course of withdrawing from caffeine. So basically, let's say that you take caffeine every single day before your workouts. If I take that away, how does your performance suffer on day 1 of having no caffeine? How does it suffer on day 2, 3, 4, and 5? And at what point are you, back to normal? So these are really important questions when it comes to guiding how we do these research protocols. And I don't think we necessarily have enough evidence to do that yet.
Okay, excellent. So, some practical stuff here. So you're saying that you can just take caffeine before your workout and it won't suffer, like you won't lose the effect, or
right now that's what the evidence out there would suggest. So they'll do studies where they will do a normal, pretty standard caffeine study, give you caffeine, exercise, see what happens. And there have been studies that separate them into people who never have caffeine, people who have a ton of it. Doesn't seem to matter. Okay, so that's the evidence we have so far. We've also found they've taken subjects who are, very regular caffeine consumers, and they had them either do exercise right after caffeine, or, they kind of did a crossover. They said, well, before we do the test, let's have you abstain from caffeine for 4 days. Basically try to knock you back down and then see how you perform. And that didn't appear to have an effect either. So it looks like, to answer your question in a very short sentence, when it comes to exercise performance, it doesn't really matter if you're a normal consumer or not. The caffeine should have the same effect on exercise.
Okay, that's interesting. Over to another topic regarding caffeine, because another popular supplements that a lot of people use is creatine, and for many years people have talked about that caffeine may potentially lower the effect of creatine, and I know that you and I think Abby Smith was also included in that study
Yep.
where we actually looked at this. So
Yeah.
Could you explain what the actual aim of the study was, how you designed it, and what you actually found in the study?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is a funny story because this was something that I came across as a junior in my undergraduate degree. Didn't have the ability to really look into it at that point. And when I came to UNC for my master's degree, Dr. Smith Ryan said, what would you like to do for a master's thesis? Do you have any ideas? And I said, I have an exact idea, and we ran with it. And so that's really how the study came about. Certainly she helped me put together the protocol, but the idea kind of stewing for a couple years. And it's really humorous because I came across a couple studies, and they indicated, one study can never tell the whole story. We have to replicate things to have confidence in the outcome. But I found a paper by Vandenberg and his colleagues that said, if we give you caffeine every day during your creatine loading, the creatine doesn't seem to work. And they were confused because they thought it would actually help. And they followed up and they said, well, it looks like we did a very similar protocol. Not only did the actual performance not improve, but it looks like there's maybe a mechanism here regarding muscle relaxation time. So they basically found a pretty reliable protocol with their caffeine and creatine where there seems to be something going on. Okay, and that's really all there was out there on the topic. So I remember going around at a conference one summer after we had planned this study, and I was all excited about it, talking to colleagues that I have a ton of respect for. Really excellent faculty members who do this type of research. And they just looked a little disappointed And I said, waste of time. We know that that's not true. And I was really shocked because there's not a lot of data on it, but all the data out there seems to be pointing in one direction, but no one will acknowledge it. At least no one at that level of academia. So I was just really surprised by the discrepancy between what the limited evidence shows and what the common belief is. So that's kind of why we went forward with it. So basically the idea was we're going to load people with creatine, right? So with that in mind, you're going to start out with a creatine group and you're going to have a placebo group, right? And we're going to load for 5 days, 20 grams a day, a pretty standard creatine loading protocol. And the idea was we would have two other groups. One group would have a caffeine supplement every morning during the creatine loading. The other group would have coffee every morning along with their creatine. So the idea was a lot of these people who refute the idea of an interaction between caffeine and creatine, they say, well, it can't matter because a lot of the early creatine studies, they would tell the subjects to mix it into a warm beverage, which would typically be caffeinated coffee or caffeinated tea. But that brings us back to the same point that we can't necessarily say that coffee is caffeine water because it's not. So that's kind of how we set up the study to see if that daily dose of caffeine or coffee would influence the effectiveness of creatine. And so we did that. We had them do some strength and some sprint exercises. And, you know, in my mind going into it, was really intrigued to see what the outcome would be, intrigued to see if we would replicate the previous findings showing that interaction. And what we found, unfortunately, with the performance data was that none of the groups performed significantly better than the placebo. So the issue there is that if your creatine group alone didn't do better than the placebo, it's very difficult to make inferences about what happened between the caffeine and the coffee, if that makes sense. So if we can't definitively show within our design that the creatine worked, then we can't say whether or not the coffee or the caffeine had any effect on the performance outcome. Basically, all groups performed at a very similar level. So to be honest, that was a little bit disappointing, but with human performance research, you get what you get and you report it, and that's kind of the end of the story. Sometimes your data don't conform to, you know, the excitement in your head about what questions you can really answer. But having said that, we did find one really interesting thing that seems to be a very consistent finding as well. And it kind of goes back to what you were talking about with your athletes taking coffee, but in a little bit different direction. So our performance outcomes, pretty much the same across groups. We did find, we measured serum creatinine levels, so did a little blood draw, and we found that basically every group taking creatine, the serum creatinine levels went up. And that is, it's not groundbreaking, but it's important to verify that pattern, because I'm sure if you work with athletes, it's not rare to find an athlete come in and say, oh my God, my blood work's terrible. My doctor thinks my kidneys are falling out because look at my creatinine. And I got a question about this 2 weeks ago. And I said, for a liability reason, I can't tell you to ignore it, because that would be pretty dumb on my part. But, you know, don't make your funeral arrangements yet. Creatinine will go up if you're taking really large doses of creatine. So it's important to establish what those ranges are. And we've contributed to that body of literature in that regard. But the really interesting finding was, of the 13 subjects we had who were taking creatine with the caffeine supplement, we had 4 complain that they were having basically gastrointestinal discomfort, so some kind of GI issue. We got that in no other groups, including the coffee group, which was a little bit unusual. So we looked back into some of these other studies, and we found that's a pretty consistent finding, is that when you have high-dose caffeine and high-dose creatine, about 30 to 40% of the sample is going to report that they had some level of GI distress. So it does seem to be one of those things that it happens time and time again. I can't tell you exactly why that's the case. I'd probably have to defer to somebody with a much stronger background when it comes to GI physiology and the gastrointestinal system. But it is intriguing that from sample to sample, it seems to be a similar ratio or percentage, and it seems to be found pretty commonly. And ultimately, that resulted in me kicking myself. Not necessarily, but just it like gave me a flashback to a conversation that I had at a conference with Roger Harris. So Roger Harris is like the father of creatine. I'm pretty sure he's the first person who said, what if we gave creatine to people and measured their performance afterward? I mean, he's really groundbreaking researcher. And I was talking about this, and he said, oh, yeah, we tried that. We didn't publish it, but it just people's stomachs. And so it was one of those things where, because he had never published it, it hadn't gotten out. But it seems to be a pretty consistent finding that this combination of high-dose creatine and high dose of caffeine anhydrous in a supplement form really does seem to cause some of those GI issues. And the really crazy thing is that the coffee didn't. So you would need some further research to have confident conclusions, but at the very least, it can tell you, well, that's interesting. Like I said, everybody says there can't be this interaction because of all these studies that use coffee. And it is possible that maybe some of this effect might be due to just having an upset stomach and performing poorly. Because, I'm sure it's really hard to go in the gym and do your best when you don't feel well.
Yeah.
So I can't say that's the whole effect. I can't say that definitely is why those old studies seem to work with coffee, but the ones with caffeine supplements have not. But it's definitely an interesting finding that I really hope that other people build upon that and continue to pursue this question. I know when I started the study, I was hoping we would get this perfectly clean outcome where we showed conclusively, this is where this interaction's occurring, or there's no interaction there. But it looks like there's definitely more research to be done on this question.
Interesting. What did the participants actually mix the creatine in?
So we instructed them to mix it into it was in water with a little bit of flavoring so that people weren't super sure about what they were getting. But they were told to just mix it into water. And we said, for your tastes and preferences, here's the volume of water that we recommend. If you want to go higher, you want to go lower, warm versus cold, that's kind of up to you. Just make sure that it mixes evenly and thoroughly. So that was kind of the recommendation given.
Excellent. So, based on what you're saying now, is that we still don't know if there is an interaction, like the mechanism behind why this is appearing, that you get a lower effect of the creatine when you use a higher dose of caffeine.
I would say that we do not know conclusively. I would say that there's really three strong possibilities, there's three possibilities, we'll say. So the original researchers who identified this interaction, we'll say, they said that it was all about what was going on at the level of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Basically, they were looking at muscle relaxation time, and they think that was really the mechanism, was that caffeine blunted creatine's effects on helping muscles relax quicker and basically slowing down cross-bridge cycling. So the idea is that would mess with force production. Roger Harris would tell you, I'll tell you based on conversations with him, I don't want to put words in his mouth, that it might be an issue of just GI discomfort following the protocol, and that people have an upset stomach during the test. Now there is, or even during their training leading up to it, there are some limitations to that theory in some instances where you'd say, well, that might not be the case, but the other possibility is that there's no interaction at all. So unfortunately, we don't have a conclusive answer, but with the evidence we have, as a practitioner, as a teacher, what do we draw from it? I would say that it all boils down to a very safe recommendation, a very prudent recommendation would be, if you're going to use both, use them both with intent, plan it out. So basically what I would recommend is you take your caffeine dose for the day in close proximity to your workout, 30 to 90 minutes before. And I think it would be prudent, or the cautious approach would be to ingest your creatine doses at a different time of the day. Preferably, so if you work out in the morning, take your caffeine when you work out, do that. Take your creatine at night. I mean, it's a very safe and simple solution, possibly, for what might be going on.
Excellent. That was really interesting, especially with the findings that you found in the study. So thank you so much for doing this podcast, Eric. I thought it was really interesting, the points that you mentioned. Where can people read more about you?
So I have I'm on Facebook and Twitter. If you just search my name, Eric Trexler. And I think I'll probably give you a link to all my publications on PubMed. So if people want to look into more stuff that I've done, that would be a good place to do it. But yeah, I'm pretty active on social media, so that'd probably be the place to find me.
Excellent. I'll put
and thanks for having me. I think Tusen Talk, right?
Tusen Takk, yeah. Tusen Takk in Norwegian.
Yeah, that is the extent of my Norwegian, but I really appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate my buddy Luke, who knows a little bit of Norwegian, and he told me to say that.
Excellent.
I'm glad he didn't. He really easily could have played a trick on me, couldn't he? Of just say something terrible and to say, trust me, it's just thank you.
Yeah.
He's a good friend.
That's usually what people do.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right, Eric. Thank you so much once again for doing this podcast, and have a great day.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.